So welcome again to today's BrandSquare presentation. I'm Kathy Oneto, and I'm Vice President of Brand Strategy here at Anthem Worldwide in our San Francisco office. And I'm going to be speaking to you today about 3 generations of women and how to speak to their true motivations. And this presentation is inspired by a paper that I wrote on this topic. And I'm going to go ahead and just jump right into it since we have a lot to cover today. And I'll start by saying, you know, for marketers, they should really be excited that their muse, the American woman, is actually gaining more and more influence. And, you know, we believe that's here to stay. And when you consider these statistics, and I'm sure many of folks are familiar with hearing these types of statistics over these last couple of years, that women are gaining this newfound power. Now, we know that women in America have controlled most of household spending. The statistic that we have here is 75% of household spending. You know, sometimes that's debated, but the reality is we know that women control the majority of household spending. We also know that women are becoming more and more educated. So 60% of all college degrees are now going to women. You have 60% of master's degrees going to women. You have 50% of law and medical degrees, and even 42% of MBAs going to women today. Now, most studies don't necessarily claim this, but in addition, some economists are actually forecasting that women, average women in comparable roles with men, will actually start to earn more than men by 2024. And then even when we look at today, I think people need to recognize that in 4 out of 10 American households today, women are actually already the primary breadwinner. And so what we were wondering as we started to look at this topic was, with all this newfound power, are women actually feeling more pressure? And we asked them this question in a survey that we fielded. And we actually found that no, not necessarily. Less than 30% of women today feel added pressure to do more these days, given all this news in the last 2 years about the rising power of women. Now, when we stepped back and saw this data and we thought about it a little bit more, we said, well, of course not. You know, women, frankly, are already expected and motivated to do a lot, and that's what the rest of our data showed as well. But interestingly, for those women who actually rated this question yes and actually do feel that pressure, those expectations and motivations are actually magnified. So, you know, what we are really seeing with women today is that, you know, we're not fighting for rights anymore. Really what women are focused on is really more about their own empowerment, their own choices, their own motivations. And again, women in our study confirmed this. 86% of female respondents thought that women should both pursue their own personal motivations and be able to make their own choices and not be judged by them. And yet we also saw a conflict as we were researching for this paper. And that conflict was around the fact that despite the fact that women want to follow their own personal motivations, there are some persistent expectations that exist. And in this paper and in this talk today, we're going to talk about those expectations and how they relate to three generations of women. We looked at Millennials, we looked at Generation X, and we also looked at Boomers. And what we found was that there was these persistent expectations for women to do it all, to look good while doing it, and to still have people like them in all of that. So let's take a little bit more look at our survey and what we took a look at. What we tested were some cultural expectations that women seem to have that persist over time. And what we wanted to look at was whether or not those expectations were consistent and aligned to women's true motivations. And in looking at this, what we were wondering for marketers, is there an opportunity to actually connect with women driven from a different part of themselves? And especially given the fact that women's desire today to follow really their own path. So that was the motivation behind looking at the study. We conducted a study with today's women with Ipsos, and this was conducted with over 1,000 women from their US online panel. And again, we asked them about expectations and motivations, and we looked at those across 4 different areas. The areas of do it all, look good, be nice, and then some personal motivations. And again, we looked at those across 3 generations of women, Millennials, Generation X, and Boomers. And what we found overall, and I mentioned this a little earlier, is that women are highly expected and highly motivated to do many of these things. So the majority of the factors that we tested actually had 50% or more women agreeing that they were expected and motivated to do them. So in some respects, we were wondering, well, why might this be the case? And we found, some good understanding of this from the authors of the book Women Don't Ask. And they had this comment to say about the effects of socialization, that, socialization does such a thorough job of teaching little girls their proper role that by the time they reach adulthood, they believe that their gender-appropriate impulses and behaviors are actually intrinsic expressions of their personalities rather than learned behavior. So perhaps women get these things confused. And yet what we found first and foremost was that women still are personally motivated, first and foremost. So you have 76% of women who feel motivated to follow their own personal motivations, which is a significant difference versus 62% of them who are simply feeling expected to. And interestingly, of all the factors that we tested, the two that rose to the top were ones that we would consider to be more personal motivations, and those were health and happiness. Now, interestingly, women are both feeling expected and motivated to have these things. So again, the cultural expectations and both their desires get conflicted here in some respects. So really what it comes down to is, despite women wanting to follow their own motivations, what we continue to find both in our survey and through secondary research is that these expectations persist. And those expectations, again, that I mentioned were to do it all, to look good, and to be nice. And we saw that these were, interestingly, consistent across all the different generations that we considered, despite the fact that they grew up with different childhoods. One would think different progression and messages, as well as the fact that they're in different life stages. But we found that these expectations were consistent. So we're going to first take a look at those expectations in a little bit more detail, and then we'll look specifically at each of the generations. So the three expectations, let's first take a look at do it all. So the reality is that women juggle a lot, and they probably always have in many respects. But this is likely going to be a permanent state going forward, and really is just a reality of being a woman today. If we start by looking at just women and women working, frankly, women have been joining the workforce for quite some time, and it's been exponential or increasing over the decades. So you take in the 1970s, where only a third of women were in the workforce at that time, jumped to 60% by the 1990s, and today is actually at 70%. And, there had been some research in the past that had talked about, like, well, women are starting to choose not to work anymore. But what some of the more recent research has said, they aren't opting out. Rather, 86% of professional women who left the workforce actually did so for workplace factors such as inflexible jobs. So it's not so much that they don't want to work, they're just finding it difficult to manage with the options that are available to them today. Now, with women working outside the home more, we all know kind of women are still doing a lot of work inside the home. So there was an Oxford University study that was conducted in the last year or so, where they looked at many different countries, but the United States was included in this. And what the researchers found was that women will be still doing the majority of the work for quite some time. So men are not projected to equally share in the household work until 2050, is what this study found. Now, there are socialization factors that they said was partly responsible for this, but what we also found in our study, and that we found quite interesting, was that not only are women actually feeling expected to make sure the household runs smoothly, but at 77%, but frankly, 74% of them were also motivated to. So perhaps women are actually, as much as many women probably will complain, like, hey, I want more help here, some women are actually quite motivated to make sure the household runs smoothly. And interestingly, in our qualitative research that we performed as well, we heard this from several women, where there was some pride in that, where they really wanted to actually have some role. It doesn't mean that it doesn't take away the pressure of trying to fit everything into the day. So now, despite the fact that we've been hearing recently in the news that, fewer people are getting married or are married today, in certain studies are actually finding like women do prefer to get married and are still interested in having children. So over 60% of women ages 30 to 60 rated marriage and relationships and parenthood is very important at this stage in their lives. And we found a similar thing. 51% of women felt expected to be in a relationship, but 59% of women were also motivated to be in a relationship. Yet despite all these facets of women's lives, again, 53% of women are feeling expected to do it all, but really only 44% of women are really feeling motivated to be doing it all. So this do it all message is really not a motivating message for women. While they may have all these different facets of women's lives, it's not a message that resonates. I kind of think about an ad that I tend to use to demonstrate this, where I kind of always chuckle at it when I see it, but it's actually quite frightening, where you often see a young professional woman with a toddler on her hip. She's dressed in a suit, and it's for an MBA program. And I sometimes just wonder, how in the heck do you expect this woman who's likely working full-time, who also has a toddler, to go and get a night MBA? And I kind of sometimes wonder, well, is that MBA program having daycare? And are they also offering take-home meals? And perhaps if they're not, perhaps that's an opportunity actually out there. But I think that that's just one example of a company or an educational company in this regard that isn't really tapping into women's true motivations and is perpetuating this message of the do-it-all woman. So now let's move on to looking good. So despite all the stats that I mentioned earlier about all this kind of newfound power, it's interesting that women's physical appearance remains a priority in today's culture. And perhaps that isn't too surprising, but when in conflict or in contrast to those stats, it kind of is. But looking good really has deep-rooted norms. So 64% of women in our study felt expected to be feminine, and 58% of them were also motivated to. And this isn't too surprising when you look at analyzing media storylines, and this is from a study. The focus in the media still tends to focus on how women look rather than on what they do or who they are. And this last season of television, emphasized this, which was quite interesting. So you had Pan Am, which was on the ABC channel, and then you had the Playboy Club, which much to my perhaps happiness, it was canceled after about 2 showings. But interestingly, the ABC channel, not only had these beautiful looking women, but they actually talked about the show, and this is their language, featuring the dames of the sky who do it all and do it at 30,000 feet. So again, perpetuating these norms of not only looking good, but also doing it all. Now there was a Melissa Mayers in the Los Angeles Times, and I'm just going to read this quote. She had an interesting point of view on both of these shows. And I know that these shows came out kind of in response to Mad Men and the success of Mad Men. But she had to say, at a time when many men are anxious about job stability and women are getting higher college degrees, Pan Am and the Playboy Club recall a less threatening era when an ambitious woman's prime goal was to serve the guys who ruled the boardroom. So when you read that and you see these shows, for me, it's really not consistent with today's view of women and empowerment if you contrast that back to the stats, again, that I mentioned earlier. And then finally, just to finish on looking good, we still see in advertisements and elsewhere that airbrushing is still a widespread practice. And really, it just continues to raise these unrealistic expectations of how women should look. So the expectations of women to be pretty and always look good is certainly still emphasized throughout society, regardless of a woman's age, which I'll speak to a little bit more later. And then finally, talking about being nice. So women have been taught and socialized to be polite and nice and be the good girl. And that's been for centuries, probably, but certainly decades. And interestingly, it really is core to a woman's nature. So we found that 82% of women both felt expected to be nice, but also felt motivated to be nice. But if you look at the scientific research, perhaps this isn't too surprising because the research actually suggests that women are behaviorally kind of biologically built to be this way. We tend to be biologically more caring and inclusive. So that's kind of true. But you know, there are some downsides to this. And I think when women do tend to be overly direct or overly aggressive, you know, in any facet of life, it tends to reflect poorly on them. And you can all just think about Hillary Clinton during the recent presidential campaign, you know, where she kind of had to deal with these implications of how she was being viewed. There's also been widespread kind of research around it also impacts women's ability to negotiate or how they get represented in the workforce. So nice girls don't get the corner office, or, you know, women expect in a good girl way employers to be fair about pay. They worry that people won't like them if they negotiate too hard. So despite all of this, you know, fact that women are getting more educated, more capable, more accomplished, women still feel pressure to do it all, to look good while doing it, and to have people like them. So now let's go ahead and talk about the generations, because again, what we found were these were persistent despite the fact, as I mentioned earlier, that these women grew up differently and they're in different stages of their lives. So we looked at three different generational targets, as I mentioned earlier, Millennials, Generation X, and Baby Boomers. And we defined these groups according to how the Pew Research Center defines them. And you see kind of the birth dates there that define these groups up on the screen. So let's start first with millennials. So interestingly, you know, millennials feel more pressure than the other generations. You know, when we asked that question about do you feel more added pressure, 40% of millennial women actually felt that way, in contrast to less than 30% on average. Now, in some respects, may not be too surprising because of the stage of life that these millennials are in. You know, all of us in our early 20s, I think, wanted to take on the world. And in our data continue to support that. So 65% of millennial women felt both expected to do it all, which was significantly different than the other two cohorts. But 58% of them were also motivated to do it all. And again, that was significantly different than the other two cohorts. And that's likely because of the stage of life that they're in. But interestingly, you know, these women also very much want fulfillment and balance. So 81% of millennials are both motivated to have balance in life and to be fulfilled. And perhaps it's because these young women also grew up in a different era in that they saw their moms or other people's moms working and trying to do it all, and yet they were motivated to do the same, and yet they also know how challenging that is. So they really are seeking more of fulfillment and balance. And some other stats from another study that we referenced in the paper talked about, you know, 72% of millennial women work for personal and professional fulfillment. There's that personal kind of core motivation again that they're looking for. And then also 60% of them felt like work-life balance was the most important decision factor in seeking a job. So these women are motivated by this balance seeking, if you will. You know, so then coming back to looking good, you know, these women are not immune to this. So one might expect that, okay, with the rising power of women, perhaps the impact of looking good perhaps has decreased over time. And it's actually the opposite. So 75% of millennial women feel expected to be attractive, and this was actually the highest across all generations. So this generation certainly is not immune to the looking good ideal. So let's talk next about Generation X. These women really bear the brunt of the do-it-all conflict. And I think it's partly because they live between these two generations of the millennials and the boomers. And what we found was they had the largest gap between those women who feel expected to do it all versus those who are actually motivated to do it. I think these women are really feeling the brunt of that pressure the most. And again, that may be partly due to life stage, but I think it's also partly due to where they have come in terms of what expectations were set while they were kind of growing up and in between these two generations. In addition, these women also want to make sure the household runs smoothly. So 80% of Generation X is wanting to make sure the household runs smoothly. Again, contrast that to the 74% that I mentioned earlier. So the reality is these women are busy. Over 40% of Generation X women agreed, I need help getting everything done in the day that's on my plate. And almost 50% of Generation X women also said, I wish companies provided services that would help me fit everything into my day. And more important for marketers, 47% rather of these women agree that they'll pay more for products that make their lives easier. So there's definitely an opportunity here for marketers to develop products and services and speak to these women in a way to help them with everything going on in their day. Generation X women, again, this contrast of the do-it-all versus their personal motivations, they're the most conflicted. So there was a 16-point gap between Generation X women who feel motivated to follow their own personal motivations at 72% versus those who are actually feeling expected to. So these women are really personally motivated and seeking to do that. And yet they have this they aren't naive. They recognize that balance is kind of a joke. And for that reason, these women recognize that they really need to define having it all on their own terms. It really is subjective, and they need to define what works for them. Again, being personally motivated, making our own choices, and then therefore not being judged by them. So let's move on to baby boomers. Baby boomers are not done and out. Anybody who's a baby boomer listening would, I'm sure, rally behind that statement. But interestingly, baby boomers were just as eager to be working as evidenced here. So, over 50% of baby boomer women are motivated to work. 70% of them are motivated to have financial independence. These women are also seeking to be in relationships, and actually we found that 61% of them are motivated to be in a relationship, and that was the highest that we saw across all of the different generations. And interestingly, the biggest gap that we saw between being expected to be in a relationship versus being motivated to. And also for baby boomers, this looks still matter. They're not immune to this message around beauty. And so 58% of baby boomer women feel expected to be attractive versus 62% who feel expected to be feminine as well. So they're not immune to this message. And interestingly, Gloria Steinem, of all people, had this to say about the matter. This is a quote from her. The part that's hurtful is that having worked hard and continuing to work hard at 73, I still find accomplishments attributed to my appearance. I would have thought I could outgrow that by now. So of all people, here Gloria Steinem is still, with all that she's accomplished, still being spoken to and asked questions about her looks. So again, while in distinct life stages, these three expectations have continued to be consistent and persistent across these generations. Well, let's get down to, okay, well, what does this mean for the marketer? What do we do about this? Well, one thing is we need to take a look at the state of communication. The media, the entertainment industry, and even advertisers have not kept up with the complexity and changing role of women today. And there have been other studies that have commented on this and things, other studies and papers that we referenced around this. But we also asked this question in our own survey, and we found that 60% of women agreed that the media, entertainment, and marketing advertisements don't accurately represent women of today. So there certainly is an opportunity here to speak to women in a slightly different way. In addition, what we found is that women are seeking communication that speaks to their motivation and is more genuine and real. So 75% of the women stated that they would prefer genuine, real communication from brands. So again, there's really an opportunity here, it seems, from our perspective, to talk to women in a slightly different way. With this in mind, first and foremost, marketers should do what marketers do, which is focus on solving consumers' problems or meeting her needs and desires, and making sure that we're really doing so in a way that's in alignment with her true motivations. Another thing to consider, because women hold this perspective, is how do we actually build back that trust and start to enter a conversation with women to build a stronger, deeper connection that's real and authentic. You know, it's interesting when you think about the fact that bloggers, the majority of them are women, and that you have so many that are eagerly participating in that kind of conversation and dialogue. And in some respects, it's kind of perhaps not so surprising that one might say, you know, well, I can't trust establishments anymore in terms of what they're saying to me, but rather I can trust my other, you know, trusted women out there, and I'd rather listen to what they have to say and get sound advice from them versus perhaps things that have been influenced by these expectations that have been set out in the world. So getting advice devoid of suggestion, I might say. So what we talked about and what we're going to share is like, well, how can we speak to these women a little bit more through some motivating messages? And the first thing that we looked at were hopes that these women hold for other generations of women. And hopes really are, you know, represent those feelings of desire for a certain thing to happen. So those motivations. So we tested a number of statements and we found that these were quite motivating. Consider these hope statements. So 91% of these women that we talked to hope that women know they can do whatever they want in life. 89% of them hope that women will always be in a position to care for themselves. 87% of them hope that women have a marriage and a relationship that's a partnership. 84% of them hope that women don't put as much pressure on themselves, and 74% of them hope that women embrace their femininity. So these are empowering statements that we think can serve as jumping off points for marketers to start to consider how to speak to women. They really allow women to be women. And in some respects, what we think is that, you know, products can support all that women want to do and really empower them. And communications can really start to show women as they see themselves instead of how our culture, perhaps inculcated by these persistent expectations, kind of sees women. We also looked, as I mentioned, to several other motivating messages, and we tested 15 of motivating messages, and what we found were 60% of our motivating messages rated above 60% with these women. So we actually felt like we touched a nerve here. We actually found some motivating statements that might serve, again, as jumping off points for marketers to consider speaking to women slightly differently around these areas where we see these persistent expectations. So perhaps not surprisingly, we found that 4 of the top 9 statements that we tested were around beauty. And what we asked women to rate is how motivating is each of these following statements to you personally. And what you're seeing up here are top 2-box scores across generations. And so again, you saw that these beauty statements actually were quite motivating. So 80% saying that true beauty exists at all ages, that statement is motivating. 76% inner beauty is just as important as outer beauty. 76% confidence is beautiful. 66% beauty is making the most of what you got. So these are definitely different ways of talking about beauty, which happen to be quite motivating to women. Personal motivations also resonated. So we had 80% saying life is what I make of it. 68% me time is important time. And 68% also saying make your life work for you. And then finally, the 2 other statements rounding out the 9 were around love and balance. Now, the love one, taking it from a slightly different angle, but 67% found it motivating to talk about love yourself first, as well as 67% rating making life easier so you can focus on the things important to you as being something that was motivating. So what we really saw here is that with today's women, you know, there's an opportunity for brands to have to really influence them and to have more positive expectations for themselves and to have those be more in line with their own motivations. We know that brands have impact on culture around the world, and brands, we believe, can have a positive cultural influence in this regard. So in summary, you know, women really are more empowered. They're a strong force in the workplace, at home, with families, and in relationships. And they're more personally motivated, and they want to make their own choices and not be judged by them. And so what we really find, and what we learned in this study, is that there may be a new way to market to women across generations. And instead of continuing to reinforce the traditional stereotype of the do-it-all, look good, and be nice woman, that marketers have an opportunity to evolve their approach. And that marketers can really start a dialogue based on a foundation of empathic understanding rather than speaking simply from an informed vantage point. And again, perhaps brands can have that positive cultural influence, one that is aligned with women's true motivations. So I think I'm impressed. I'm actually finishing right on time. Thank you so much for being with me today. That concludes the presentation, but I'm happy to answer questions. And I know I went through a lot of data today, but the full paper you can find online on the SHOC website at www.shoc.com/knowledge-center/white papers. So if you really want to get the nitty-gritty of all the detail that I went through today, please go to the website to find the paper. But I'm also happy to be contacted directly if you have any specific questions, and you see my email there up on the screen, which is Kathy, Kathy.Oneto, Oneto, @anthemww.com. And with that, I'd be happy to answer a couple of questions. All right, so this first question, so you said you don't speak to women solely from an informed vantage point, or don't speak to women solely from an informed vantage point. Can you explain this a bit more? So yeah, so I kind of say that in contrast to my other statement, which is to operate and create a dialogue from an empathic vantage, from an empathic kind of place, if you will. And I think, you know, marketers truly, obviously, are talking to women often. Marketers obviously are doing market research, but sometimes some companies are kind of scratching the surface. And I think, okay, I know who she is, I know the demographics, I know the data points, I know her purchasing habits, and I may know some surface level motivations, but are we really digging deeper to understand those true motivations and trying to understand that? So I'll explain this by contrasting two different ads or marketing programs that I'm familiar with. So one is for Electrolux, and I don't know if people are familiar with this ad, but it had Kelly Ripa in it. And I think that, you know, the ad actually starts with her, you know, on the set of the Kelly and Regis show, which now has changed since Regis has moved on his way. But nevertheless, it started with her there, and she races home, and you see her preparing for a party, running around the kitchen, doing all these different things. And of course, while she's doing this, she looks gorgeous and beautiful and perky, of course. And then she ends this ad by actually saying to women, you know, be more amazing. That's the concluding message. So to me, that's just like a prime example of the stereotype of the do-it-all, look good, and be nice woman. And so I would argue in that ad, like, did they really scratch deeper to understand whether or not that message in that ad was going to be motivating to women? I will tell you it was not motivating to me, and I didn't find it believable at all that Kelly Ripa was going to be doing this. But contrast this to a Jones of New York program that they've been doing, which is around empowering your confidence. And they're actually doing a number of programs to empower women and empower women in the workforce. They have this little black book on their website that's full of career advice from both, you know, some famous people as well as just from individuals who are signing this book. And I would argue that that program has a deeper and is coming from a deeper understanding of women versus, say, the Electrolux ad. So hopefully that gives a little bit more context to that question. Are there any other questions? All right, so the next question was, what would you recommend to get closer to women to build empathic understanding? Any thoughts on research approaches? So this is one I get a little passionate about. I think that, you know, marketers probably too often rely on quantitative research reports or going to focus groups where they're sitting behind a two-way mirror. And something that I really advocate is building gut about your consumers. And I don't think you do that unless you start to have a dialogue directly with your consumers. So what I would advocate is doing one-on-one interviews, going in-home, doing shop-alongs. But, don't be afraid to intercept people in the store either and just start to have a conversation with women or with whomever your target is. The other thing that I would advocate even is if you do sampling programs and things of that nature, go out in the marketplace, talk to these women, actually start to have a one-on-one dialogue. Because I think it's only then as you get out there that you start to have a deeper understanding, a richer understanding of your consumer target. Okay. The next question is, based on this research, where do you see the biggest opportunities with women? Two things I'll mention quickly. One is with Generation X women. So I talked about this, that these women really do need help. And for those who can afford it, they're willing to pay more to get that help. So that's one. The second I would look at is boomer women in the beauty industry. I think there's a really big opportunity there. The AARP actually did a study on this. And what they reported was that the majority of baby boomer women actually feel forgotten by the beauty industry. And what these women see is that the beauty industry speaks to, always represents youthful women and doesn't really represent this age group. And so these women want to, they want to remain looking youthful, but they don't really see themselves in many of the ads that are being produced. So I really think given the size of the baby boomer population, I think there's a great opportunity for someone to really be understanding that group better and really trying to meet their needs. So there's a question here about the Dove ad campaign that used real women who are not anorexic, but got a lot of flack for being too real. Can I comment on that? I wasn't aware of that they commented on the fact that they were too real, and perhaps what you're suggesting is maybe it wasn't aspirational enough for some women. But I think the Dove ad campaign actually did move in the right direction and was coming from the right place. Perhaps there is something that's a balancing act there, but I think that, personally to some degree, I actually think that campaign was a good campaign and one that actually started to have women say, see, somebody understands me. So I don't know, the person who wrote the question, if you want to give any more context in terms of what the specifics were around it being too real, or any deeper thoughts on that, I'd be happy to try to answer that more specifically. But personally, I feel like, that campaign actually was a strong campaign, and I think, resonated with a number of women. All right, the next question was, millennials seem in conflict, feeling the pressure and actually motivated to do it all, yet wanting balance and fulfillment. What do I think is driving this, and what are the implications? I think that, I talked about it a little bit, but I think one of the things that's really happening here is simply the stage that these young women are in, as well as kind of the culture that they grew up in. And I think that they find that they really don't have to be pressured. They aren't limited. They see a world of opportunity. And I think that's part of their stage, as I mentioned. But I also think that in terms of that balance and fulfillment, I mentioned it a little bit earlier, which is I think they've seen the impact of trying to do it all. And I think that what they're trying to do is kind of say, hey, I want to do it all, but I want to figure out a way to do it on my terms. And frankly, maybe they'll be the generation that is finally going to get employers and perhaps government regulations to finally make some changes in terms of how do we accommodate women, and perhaps, how do we change it such that you don't have so many women that are having to opt out of the workforce. All right, so perhaps this will be our last question. This next one, so we saw that several of the factors that you tested were both expected and quite motivated to do or be certain things, that women were both expected and quite motivated to do or be certain things. And you suggested that socialization is likely behind that. Is this something that will help or harm conversations with women? It's a really good question. The way that I would almost come at that is, not so much say that it will help or harm. I think it leans a little bit more towards the harm side, but I think what I'd say, it just means it makes it more complicated. And I think what it means is sussing out those motivations and figuring out what those motivations are requires a bit more digging and requires a little bit harder work, if you will. So, if you go into and you choose to do a focus group where you have 8 women sitting around a table, what you might start to hear are more of those expectations and those socialized kind of expectations coming through. You may not really get down into, well, what really are those true core motivations that are driving women today? So I think that's where I would say the challenge is really more so in that space of sussing out the true motivations and making sure you're getting behind what might be considered expectations versus what women are truly motivated to be and do. And I think I saw another comment here just about the Dove campaign, which maybe I'll try to address really quickly if I could. So you're right, I also liked it, Dove campaign, but I do not see other campaigns picking up on that approach. The flack I'm referring to was anecdotal and editorial comments, etc. I did not hear many women object to it, mostly men. Well, that's an interesting observation that it was men who were the ones who were objecting to it. So, but who is the purchaser? And I think that's what we need to remember is who's actually purchasing these products. The majority of the media, I will say, and this is true, I don't mean to say anything that might turn some people off, but the majority of the media is controlled by men. So a lot of the messages that are being put out there in the world about women are being controlled by men. And perhaps, yes, men may not want to see real women, in quotes. Perhaps some would, I don't know. But perhaps to women, right, what's motivating to them, and they are controlling the purse strings, as I mentioned earlier, and frankly, more and more of that money is coming from their own wallets. So I think really tapping into women's true motivations is what's really important here. So I just went a minute over time, so I want to thank everyone for being with me today, and thank you for the questions. I really appreciate it. Again, my email address is up on the screen, kathy.oneto@anthemww.com, and thank you so much for being with us today.